Welcome everyone to the Adversity to Advantage podcast. I'm really excited today. We've got Paul McGregor on the line. Now, we met several months ago now, but it was at a conference, a mental health conference, and I put something out on Instagram just saying, who wants to be part of the podcast? And I think you were the first one going, yeah, I'll meet you backstage, we'll talk. Yeah. It was good. So we got a snippet of your story and I was intrigued and I knew that we had to go deeper on it. So welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
It's fun to have you because I know that we share a similar mission. So let our audience know just a little bit about you. What is it that you're passionate about at the moment?
Yeah, so kind of at the moment, in terms of mental health, is trying to normalize mental health conversations in and outside of the workplace. A lot of the work that I do is in the workplace, but I also do a lot of talks and work inside of schools, a lot of work with charities as well. So kind of really breaking down that stigma that still surrounds mental health in general.
Well, it really does, because we think and we say that the UK is kind of moving quite quickly in this conversation, and a lot more people are normalizing that conversation. But I mean, do you think that we still have a long way to go?
100%. It's one of those where I believe a lot of it is down to conditioning. So the way that I was conditioned by my parents was the way they were conditioned by their parents, and so on and so on. And I believe it's very much the way I see it, a next generation, approach, generations after that, is trying to normalize it, as we say, as early as we possibly can. So although it's getting better, there's definitely, the stigma still exists.
Absolutely. I definitely see a bit of that. And I know that this comes from a deep place for you. Based on your own story, many of us who are in this space have been impacted by poor mental health or close family who have suffered in some way. So tell us a bit about you. Why are you excited about this topic? Why are you driven to create change?
So my personal story was back in 2009 when I was 18, nearly 19 years old. I lost my dad to suicide, and that was a real shock. My dad, the way I explain it is he had everything on paper, no signs of a mental illness, full-time engineer, part-time physiotherapy business, psychology degree, meditated, read self-help books. He ran once, if not twice a day, physically healthy, just on paper, like friends, family, on paper. People used to call him perfect. So, the way I explain it is the first 18 years of my life, we were here and like mental illness was here. It's never going to impact me and my family. And then it did. And it was a really short, sudden breakdown that my dad had. That's the only way I kind of explain it. And very quickly after a change in behaviors, he went to the doctors, got prescribed antidepressants. Very shortly after that, I'm talking a couple of days, he made a serious attempt on his life. And he recovered from that luckily, because I think if we lost him on that first attempt, it would have been a lot harder because it was so quick. But when he recovered, we almost thought that everything would go back to normal. Like it was just the medication, it was just a blip, he would snap out of it, all of these negative associations with it. But he never did, and he ended up, being sectioned into a psychiatric ward, and that was our first real exposure to mental illness. Seeing my dad in a situation with people with borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, and the first exposure that I'd ever seen of a mental health ward was on a film, or something you saw on TV. And he just never really recovered from that initial breakdown. And sort of 6 months after that initial breakdown was when he took his own life. And yeah, for me, it was, I never dealt with it very well at all because I couldn't understand it. With suicide comes a lot of guilt, comes a lot of anger, comes a lot of unanswered questions. The question why just eats away at you every single day. And yeah, I kind of, me personally, I ignored it for the first 2-3 years. When I say ignore, it was like distract from it. Like, so I didn't ignore it. I was very emotional, but I was emotional in my own time and in my own space. So I would start a business. I would buy a new car. I would go out with my friends and joke and laugh at the pub and drink beer and come home and cry. And, a lot of the emotions that I was struggling with was when I was in the car on my own or at home on my own. So I found the first couple of years was just distractions, distractions, distractions. And then I personally was in quite a low place and I needed help. And that help came in the form of a therapist. And for me, that was then the real journey of starting to answer those questions. And I'm sure we can unpack it a lot more, but it still took me a good sort of 7 years to publicly start speaking about it.
And is it fair to say that your conditioning as a man, and also in this line of this family line where mental illness wasn't showing up, that you just wouldn't ask for help, or was that just out of your vocabulary to kind of say, I'm struggling and I need help?
I believe it was, and I believe as well I struggled to know where to get help. Like, you
Right.
know, me and my mum are very close, but I didn't want to talk to her I talked to her, but not in as much detail as maybe I needed to, because I didn't want to burden her. She just lost her husband. I went to see a doctor and got, pushed forward for a counseling session. And at that time it was too early. I wasn't ready. And, even looking at my friends, they're all there ready to talk to me, but I just wasn't ready to talk to them. So yeah, I think it was at that point, a big part of it was, I don't want to seek help. I'm doing what my dad did, right? I want to show everyone that I'm perfect, that I'm happy, that I'm fine, to kind of mask what's going on inside.
And so looking back, do you suspect that your dad had stuff sort of going on internally a lot longer than you actually think, based on what that short span of time that you described where things deteriorated?
Yeah, and the way I kind of look at it now is it was 11 years on the 4th of March, so 11 years has just gone, and there's two ways that I approached my dad's suicide. Number one is understanding. So understanding was, when it first happened, I didn't understand it. It was, why has he done that? He had this, he had that. And the way I understood it was, I got in a low place myself, and I could start to see, wow, I can understand why people can get here. Suicide is selfish. Like, that was what you're conditioned as well when you're kind of growing up. So understanding, and also, as you said, knowing that my dad was very unwell. My dad didn't want to die. My dad felt like he was a burden to all of us. He still loved us. But he was very unwell and he didn't get the help that he needed. So he obviously had a lot going on that we didn't know about. And again, I don't think that's our fault, because we wasn't educated to understand and spot the signs. And then the second thing is acceptance, accepting that I'll never know why. I'll never know what was going on in my dad's mind the day that he did it. And when I was trying to answer every question, that's when it becomes unbearable, because I'm never going to get the answers to every question.
And you were trying to answer them sort of in your own head, just swirling round and round, rather than kind of hearing yourself speak and getting the support to kind of decipher what was going on in your head. And
Exactly.
keep it in, right? That's where it blows up even more.
And I mean, I'm just saying this as from what I maybe understand, but this may not be correct. My dad, I've over the last 2 years, I've met a lot of people with OCD. Now, my conditioning around OCD, even the first time I ever delivered a talk, was, if you struggle with OCD, you're clean, you want stuff in the right orders, that's OCD.
Yeah.
And then, since I've been on this sort of journey, I've met people with OCD, intrusive thoughts, and different versions of the illness. And my dad ticks a lot of those boxes. Like, my dad was very obsessive in the fact that he ran every day, twice a day, but he had to run. There was a story that my mum told me when my brother was just born and she was struggling, like, as a newborn, to deal with it. And she said to him, I need your help. And he was like, I need to go for a run. She was like, no, if you go for a run, like, your bag's going to be packed and all of this. She never did do that, but he went for a run. He had to go for a run. Every day he had to run, write it in his book. Now, back then, that was my dad being a dedicated athlete, like,
Sure.
strong mentality. And even his best friend said to me a couple of weeks ago, he had the strongest mentality that he ever knew. Like, he's never met anyone with such a strong mentality as my dad, which kind of played in my mind a bit, because how can you have such a strong mentality and take your own life? So I don't know. That's kind of a question that I will never ever answer. But speaking to a lot of people with OCD, I believe my dad may have struggled with that too.
And in hindsight, and I want to go into just your journey of recovering from this, but Was there a trigger? Because you said suddenly things changed and he was sectioned, and that's quite an extreme difference from what you're describing beforehand. In your mind, do you recognize now in hindsight that something triggered that to sort of move in that way?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of, my dad just probably ignored, distracted. Like my dad was always busy. He worked in the evenings, he worked in the day, he ran,
Yeah,
he never
sit
switch
with
off.
himself, and yeah,
And I'm almost like, is that him just having this stuff going on, and I've got to do this, do this, do this, and all of a sudden it becomes unbearable, and he broke. Um, there's combinations of things like losing some money in the recession. Nothing major, but again, my dad was very obsessed with money. Saving money. My, the reason why I started my own business was my dad saved for an early retirement at 50, and he took his own life at 45. So he was super super protective and obsessed over saving money, and then he never got to where he wanted to be. Um, so like that, I think there's a combination. My nan got diagnosed with cancer, like his mum. Um, I think there was a combination of stuff that happened that maybe caused him to have that break. But the scary thing for me and everyone involved in this story is just how quick it was. It was so quick from him being the dad that we all knew to being, the only way I was explaining it is like a zombie, just someone completely out of character and different to what he was.
I mean, and so I imagine just that period of time must have been terrifying for you. Say, describing that you'd only seen sort of a mental institution on TV, or all the kind of stigmatized views of what mental illness looks like. And now here's your dad in those environments, essentially. What did you learn at that time?
Well, it's it's one of those where again you're just kind of reacting to the situation. But I mean, again, everyone has a different experience, but the experience of my dad in a mental health unit was horrible. It was cold, it was plastic, it was highly medicated, it was not a nice place, like not a nice environment. And I almost put myself in that position. I'm a dad now, and I think to myself, if I was in that environment and my kids were visiting me, my wife was visiting me, I don't know where my dad was at. And I think my dad being that guy that doesn't want to talk about his emotions and kind of bottling it up, now having the spotlight on him and him internally judging himself being in this situation, I
Yeah.
don't know whether
Just
that
saying,
helped.
isn't it? Yeah.
My dad was very holistic. My dad, he never drunk, he never took paracetamol. He would meditate, he would say drink water. He did reiki, he did, he was a runner. So I don't know if that environment helped him because it was highly medicated. It was very, you know
Sterile, yeah. And that's something we could do a whole podcast just on the mental health system, right? And how it doesn't necessarily encourage recovery, but can stigmatize people who are struggling by essentially creating environments to help people feel ill rather
mm,
than that holistic method of how do we support you to be your best self
And
with
I think
medication without.
really good, and I think the biggest takeaway, just now you've said it, is how, sounds terrible, but how normal my dad looked in that environment. And
Mm,
that, for me, now I've never thought of it this way. Looking back, that is the face of mental health. That in that environment, everyone who struggles with mental illness, we've been conditioned, look this certain way, that they are erratic. There was people out there that would scream and shout and,
yeah,
do behaviors that you would label as someone who was struggling mentally. But then there's people like my dad and a few others that would just keep themselves, do crosswords, sit there, and people would question, why are they in here? And I think that for me is the real overlook of mental health. It's not just one face, it's not just one stereotype, it can affect anyone.
absolutely. And so you experience the shock, and obviously it tears your family apart. I can imagine just the shock of it. You begin grieving, and this is what there's misconceptions about grieving as well, like that there should be a time frame, or once you've hit these 7 steps, then in a particular order, then you're good. What have you learned? And I imagine it still hits you. So I want to have total empathy for the journey you've been on. But you specifically described 7 years of going through a bit of a loop and a cycle. How do you, now that you've been through it, how would you explain to someone else, I guess, what that grief process could be like?
Yeah, it's as you said, it's a complete it's this, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's first year, terrible, but you're kind of showing everyone you're okay. The first year is very reactive, isn't it? It's very much like just trying to deal with it. And then what's funny is like year 7, 8, 9, I felt I was okay, but my wife was like, you're closing off. You're
Oh,
like,
shut it down.
yeah, you're sharp. And I'm like, no, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. I'm talking about it now. I'm out there in the workplace and etc. And she sort of noticed the difference. 10 years came round and I was like, I'm going to be fine. Last year was the hardest year that I've had for a long, 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 long time. And I don't know whether it's because it's 10 years. It's kind of an iconic number. I don't know what got into my mind. Whereas the 11 years that has just passed was a really positive experience where I felt that me doing the work that I'm doing, I feel very close to my dad. I feel like, it's horrible what happened to him, but like your whole podcast is about this. It's, what happened to my dad is hopefully from social media and talks, inspiring other people to go and get that help that they need. And this year I felt very proud of him and close to him. And next year I'll probably feel crap again. It's like, you don't know. And this one guy told me a really good way of putting it as, imagine every year of grief, you go to the beach and you're there and the waves are sort of splashing you. And the first year you turn up in just your swim shorts, you're not prepared. And like the waves are splashing. Next year you turn up and you've got, I don't know, a coat for afterwards. The next year you turn up, you've got a towel, a coat, a change of clothes. And then afterwards you're more prepared for the anniversaries that roll around. But yeah, like you said, someone says to me, it's been 11 years, you should be over it by now. You can't put time on grief.
No, and that analogy is actually really beautiful in describing what it looks like to build resilience. It isn't a perfect, it's an experiment essentially on what your emotional health needs in order to cope with different circumstances.
Yeah.
And yes, the more you've maybe been through that, the more you know personally for you, I need time out, I need to speak to my wife, I need the therapist, whatever those things are, the raincoat, the towel, whatever it might be. But essentially it's going to be unique to you. Now, there's something I've toyed with because you know a little bit of my story. So being raised in a cult and all sorts of things that have happened to me. And I speak on stages and talk about my story and essentially have done, I think what you've done, which is find some nugget of purpose in the pain, right? So some nugget of like, okay, this terrible thing has happened. How do I now help others to live a better life? You're essentially doing that as well. But there's this double-edged sword, isn't there, between putting ourselves out there. You described feeling closer to your dad, feeling like there's some kind of purpose and message, right? But the flip side can be re-traumatizing ourselves or continually repeating the story of the tough times so that that story gets stuck in our brain a little bit. And I sometimes feel both, and I'm mostly like mission focused. And then that one person will be like, don't you think that because you now have this vulnerability hangover and you did the big talk and you're crashing out, like, are you just a sucker for pain? What are your views just on that duality?
It's a really good question. And again, it's like you say, it's the journey of learning it. It's the first time I did it, I don't think first time I shared, I never shared again for like 6 months after that. But yeah, like I remember, Mental Health Awareness Week's probably the same for you. It's, you need a week shut
Twice a day, every day, yeah.
It's hard, and it's a really good question. Every time I talk, I learn something more about myself, which is a positive.
Right.
Especially if you do Q&A or podcasts. Like podcasts, I always say like therapy, right? You're asking me questions, I'm digging deeper, I'm like unpacking more stuff.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you do a talk and someone asks a question, and then you start to learn more and refine your talk, etc. But yeah, I completely understand. It's sometimes hard to always talk about it. It's sometimes I feel like, am I so obsessed with this mission now that it's taken over as well? Like I have obsessive traits as well, which are very serving in, if I want to do something, I'll try and make it happen. But is this now becoming my life? And if something, it's a really, really good question I've never thought about. But in terms of the balance, I do find it hard to balance both. But number one thing I try and do is put me first. And again, that's very unnatural in the way I'm conditioned. Like McGregors are very much people pleasers. My dad was, my mum is. You know, we put other people first, and that's us being, you know, that's empaths. That's just our natural kind of conditioning. But I'm learning over the last few years that I need to come first. For me to be the best dad, the best husband, the best, you know, person who can try and tell my story and help others, if I'm not in a good place, then that's not going to happen. So I try and put a little bit of time aside for me as much as I can as well.
So for you, and I know everyone's different, what are maybe the top 3 things that you are your go-tos for whatever you do to look after yourself, to put yourself first?
Exercise, so running a lot. At the moment, I'm doing, at the end of May, I'm doing 8 marathons in 8 days in 8 cities for like children's mental health. So raising money for teachers, and to bring awareness to 1 in 8 children now have a diagnosed mental disorder. So it's hence the 8 marathons in 8 cities. Which again, the obsessive Paul coming in. I know
running. I'm just thinking like, oh my.
And again, it's like, you know, I do feel close to my dad when we run, because we used to run together. And those moments with me and my dad was when we're running, that's when you're talking. You're like side to side, you're having a conversation. I learned a lot from my dad in those moments. Whereas when you're at home eating dinner or whatever it is, especially nowadays, there's so many more distractions. So again, it sounds a bit hippie, but sometimes going out for a run, I feel quite close to my dad. Meditation helped, but now I see running as almost a form of meditation, because it's kind of me getting rid of everything and just going for a run. Journaling really helps. So I've done structured journaling, but normally it's just a pen and a paper now and just writing down whatever's going on in here. Out. And then what I find is I can then see it from a different perspective. It almost doesn't look like my problems anymore. Like, as you know, when it's up here, it's when it's on a piece of paper, it's like, okay, I can maybe do that and figure it out. Nutrition, like, again, just simple things. If I'm eating the wrong foods, I'm not 100% strict, but 80% of the time, if I'm eating well, I feel a lot better. And then I still see Anne. I still see my therapist. Not as often, but if I need her, she's there. And, you know, I feel like I'm always learning. I still need to learn more and more. So she's always there to help as well.
And is she a specific like bereavement counselor or a regular counselor? We can all do bereavement stuff, but you know what I mean? Like, did you go like, actually, I need somebody who gets this piece?
And I don't know how you would explain Anne. She did a weekend holistic therapy course. That's all she's done in terms of qualifications.
Okay.
But Anne is very spiritual, which I was drawn towards. So for some reason, I was described, my wife, we wasn't married then, but she said, you need to go see this lady. She's like a witch. She knows more about you than you know about yourself. Ooh. And at 21, I was like, oh, I need to find out more about this. But what Anne does is she gives a massage as well. So she gives massage and you give donations. So me being the tight 21-year-old who had a back problem was like, this is perfect. I can go get a massage, put money in a pot and then leave. Yeah. But I was drawn to the whole, she's a witch. She knows more about you than you know about yourself. And I think at 21, I was very lost, like very confused, in a really bad place. And yeah, I tried a psychiatrist, I tried a counselor, I tried a bereavement counselor. And Anne was the only one that could get me to open up and share and talk. And I think what Anne has that, you know, those other counselors maybe didn't have is experience, compassion, understanding. And it doesn't matter for me what qualification she has on the wall. It's more about she's been through a lot and she knows a lot. And I was just drawn towards her.
I love that so much, because I am a clinician and I hear other clinicians in the mental health space sort of bad mouthing, like the fact that so many people are in the mental health space who don't have qualifications.
I've had it, yeah.
Yeah, no, I imagine. And it really makes me sad, because I actually think that when we only think clinicians can deal with mental health, that we're actually stigmatizing things more. Mm-hmm. Like, we're not, if we normalize the conversation, it's about all of us. It's about finding that mate or that someone that you can open up to. And a lot of what the work that I do with leaders in businesses is just having empathy and creating space. Like, you don't need to know all the signs and symptoms of everything in order to create space and have some human connection. Two more questions. I know you've got places to be, and I'm so thrilled that you're here.
I could chat forever on this. This is good.
Yeah, no, I know. We both could. That's why I'm watching the time. First of all, where can people find you? So if they want you to speak or get involved with them, where can they find you?
I'm pretty much active all across social media. So LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, all of that's pmcgregor.com, or just search for Paul McGregor. Even TikTok. Are you doing anything on TikTok?
I'm not. Are you?
Yeah, TikTok's a great platform.
I need to look you up.
TikTok's growing. And then my website is pmcgregor.com. The other way of potentially finding out a little bit more about what we're doing is I've just launched a digital platform called Every Mind at Work, which is an application for businesses to help their employees' mental health. And we also do online courses, e-learning that are interactive, and a variety of workshops as well. So that's the other one as well.
That's so exciting. You're so busy. So I'm glad you're also running and looking after yourself, and you're a dad. Oh my God, it's all happening. And so finally, if someone is struggling, I feel like we just need to go there. If somebody is struggling with their thoughts, their thinking, and perhaps on paper has that perfect thing they've curated for the world to see, but inside they're struggling in some way. What's your advice? What are the first steps that perhaps they could take? And I realize this is coming from a place where your dad sort of wasn't able to take them effectively enough, but what do you think? Or like, when should they? Because it's got to be early, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the big part of that question, is the awareness to know that you need that help. Like, yes. That for me was the hardest part, and I think that was for my dad the hardest part. So the awareness to actually step forward and say, I need help, is always, I say, the hardest step. It's always the biggest step. So if they can do that, they're in a place where they feel like they need some help. As you said, the earlier they can get it, the better, rather than waiting and waiting and waiting, and it gets worse, and then it's harder to deal with. And then secondly, I think mental health is so individual. It's like, try, as much as you possibly can, and find out what works for you. Like, I tried a lot, and a lot of it didn't work, and a lot of it did. But now I've got them learnings that I can say, all right, this really helped me, so I need to focus on here, whereas this didn't, so I'm not going to try that again. And I think mental health in particular is being very much dictated. It's like, you need to do meditation, you need to go to therapy, men need to cry. Actually, some guys don't want to cry. And then they're judging themselves.
Don't want to cry either. So
exactly. And then if we're being told you need to cry, and now we're judging ourselves because we can't cry. So I think it's so individual. So just try and see what works for you, and then focus in on what helps. And even with therapy, for me, the beginning stages was writing it down. I didn't want to tell anyone, but writing it down was my way of expressing it, even though it was just me reading it back and then throwing it away. Then it was telling someone close to me. Then it was going and seeing a therapist. So it's those kind of stages as well. So as long as you're expressing it, I think that's the main.
I love that. It's a build up. It's not a one size fits all. Try and test things, and equally, go to therapy or whatever it might be from a maintenance perspective. If you're playing team sport and you're hanging out with the guys, try and practice courage by being the first one to ask a real question that's really going to get underneath the kind of banter level, and you'd be surprised what comes back. And I imagine you feel that when you start, then people are like, oh, this is a safe space where I actually can talk. So there's just so many things we can do. Now, I'm going to put all of your contact details into the show notes so people can contact you. Paul, thank you so much for your time, and good luck with everything. I know we're going to be running into each other on the circuit, but look after you.
And you. Thank you so much for having me on.
No problem.